Have you ever felt like you were being watched, even when you were completely alone? Have you ever had that strange feeling that something isn't right, like the air around you is thicker, heavier, and the silence is unsettling? For Penelope Bernadette Gambier, this sensation began subtly, almost imperceptibly, and like many of us, she initially ignored it. After all, who could have imagined that the unknown was about to reveal itself in such a brutal and unexpected way? It was supposed to be the beginning of his life. Paris, with all its beauty and bustle, had become a painful memory. Her mother's death had left a deep wound, and all Penelope wanted was to escape. Maryland seemed like the perfect choice. A place where rural tranquility blended with the convenience of cities, a refuge where she could finally breathe without feeling the weight of such a heavy past. But what Penelope didn't know was that her escape from the city and her search for peace would take her directly to the center of something unimaginable. She quickly connected with Gilbert and Sophia, a newlywed couple who shared her love of nature. Little by little, the three formed an inseparable friendship, exploring the charming and bucolic surroundings of Maryland. Riding through the woods was a way to reconnect with the world, and above all, to reconnect with herself. Those trails were a sanctuary, a place where the problems of the modern world seemed non-existent. However, what Penelope could not predict was that the true terror was not in the busy streets of Paris, nor in its painful memories. True fear, the one that transcends logic and reason, was lurking in the peaceful woods she loved so much. Can you imagine what it would be like to encounter something that defies everything you believe possible? Something that turns the familiar landscape into a nightmare scenario? On a seemingly ordinary day, as the horses trotted calmly and the sun shone, something changed. It was as if nature, which always offered comfort, had decided to remain silent. The wind stopped. The birds are gone. And then, without warning, the peace was broken. That afternoon, Penelope would feel for the first time what it was like to be confronted with the unknown, a terror that she could never forget. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to be drawn into a reality that few could even imagine. This was the beginning of something that would change not only Penelope's life, but also her view of what really lives in this world. And perhaps you too will begin to wonder, are we really alone? As the days passed, Penelope began to notice small details that, although intriguing, seemed easily explainable. During her morning rides through the Maryland woods, there were times when everything around her just stopped. The wind, which had previously swayed the leaves gently, suddenly disappeared, leaving the air stagnant. The birds, which always filled the room with their songs, remained in a disturbing silence. It wasn't normal, but Penelope tried to convince herself that maybe it was just her imagination, a natural reaction to her desire to leave the past behind. However, what previously seemed like just a coincidence began to intensify. On some occasions, Penelope felt a strange pressure in the air, as if she were being watched. It was an oppressive feeling, something that made your heart race and your instincts alert. Gilbert and Sophia had also noticed these subtle changes. In conversations between friends, while they were riding together or resting in the shade of the trees, the joke always came up. "Maybe they are ghosts from the forest," Sophia used to say, laughing, trying to dispel the growing tension. But even as they laughed, the discomfort was palpable. One morning, Penelope woke up with a start. A strange dream had left her uneasy, but she couldn't remember the details. There was something about lights in the sky, but his mind seemed to block out the rest. Deciding to shake off the feeling, she mounted her horse and headed for a trail further away than usual, looking for a moment of peace. However, as she went deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. She stopped the horse and looked around. The silence was absolute. And then, in a corner of her peripheral vision, she saw it. In the sky, an unusual light, something that seemed to shine brightly, but without moving like an airplane or any other known object. Penelope blinked, trying to focus, but the light disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving her restless and distraught. What was that? His mind tried to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The day ended with a strange feeling that something was about to happen, something far beyond what she could imagine. That fateful afternoon, Penelope, Gilbert, and Sophia decided to go on another one of their rides. The weather was perfect. The sun shone with moderate intensity, the wind was fresh, and the feeling of freedom filled the group. As they exchanged jokes and light stories, neither of them could predict what was about to happen. Along a well-known path in the woods of Gaithersburg, they walked carefree, until suddenly something changed. Without warning, the air grew thick again, but this time the change was instantaneous and much more oppressive than before. The wind stopped blowing, the leaves on the trees became static, and the sound of wild animals disappeared completely. An absolute silence took over the environment, as if time itself had frozen. The horses, which had previously trotted calmly, began to agitate, moving nervously as if they also felt something threatening around them. It was then that, up ahead on the path, something caught Penelope's attention. In the middle of the trail, standing as if they were waiting for them, there were beings with a strange, almost surreal appearance. Small humanoid figures with shiny silver metallic costumes, seamless, and with a shine that seemed to not belong to this world. They were still, but their presence alone radiated a tension that was almost palpable. Their bodies emitted an unnatural glow that defied all logic, illuminating the forest with a light that seemed to have its own source. Penelope couldn't move, frozen in fear and disbelief. The same happened with Gilbert and Sophia, who also stared at those beings. What is this?" muttered Sophia, her voice shaking. Gilbert said nothing. His expression was one of pure shock and terror, his eyes fixed on the beings in front of him. Penelope tried to find some rational explanation, but her mind was in complete chaos. Everything she knew about the world seemed to fall apart at that moment. The beings, until then immobile, began to slowly levitate, as if defying the laws of physics. In that instant, what was a slight tension turned into absolute panic. "Run!" was the only scream that Penelope could let out, even though she didn't know if her legs would still work. As she and Sophia moved towards the horses, Gilbert remained frozen, unable to react. It was at that exact moment that one of the beings raised a weapon, emitting a cold, metallic glow. Penelope, in despair, watched the horror of seeing her friend being hit by a beam of light that consumed him in seconds. Gilbert began to scream, his voice cutting through the silent air, before his body was reduced to ash before his eyes. And just like that, in a matter of seconds, Penelope's reality was completely destroyed. When the beam of light hit Gilbert, turning his body to ash before her eyes, Penelope felt as if time had stopped. The horror of the scene momentarily paralyzed her, and the pain of Gilbert's scream of agony echoed in her mind, unbearable and almost unreal. However, Sophia didn't wait to understand what was happening. Driven by pure survival instinct, she was already running towards the horses before Penelope could fully process what was happening. "Sophia, wait!" shouted Penelope, her feet finally moving as she tried to reach her friend. She could hear Sophia's hurried footsteps and the frantic sound of horses stirring as she noticed the chaos around her. Fear took over everything. But then, another sound cut through the silence, something that made Penelope's heart stop again. A metallic sphere, small and sinister, had been launched towards Sophia, floating in the air like a patient predator. It seemed moved by an unknown and implacable force, following Sophia with frightening precision. Penelope knew what was about to happen, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. Sophia, running desperately, didn't notice the sphere until it was too late. The explosion that followed was deafening. Everything happened so quickly that Penelope barely had time to understand what she was seeing. Sophia's body was obliterated in a shower of blood and remains, scattered across the forest floor. The sounds of the world returned only to be filled with an echo of destruction and horror. Penelope stood still in shock. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her body was locked in a state of absolute terror. Gilbert, Sophia, everything she had in her new life, her friends, were now dead. And she was next. There was no doubt about that. He felt the presence of the beings approaching, almost as if they could hear the accelerated beats of his heart. She needed to move, she needed to get out of there, but everything seemed distant, as if she were trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. It was then that something inside her, perhaps the most primitive of instincts, awakened. The survival instinct. With her eyes full of tears and her body in pure despair, Penelope turned on her heel and ran. There was no more time to think or mourn, only the desperate need to escape. Every step was a battle against the fear that threatened to paralyze her again. She could hear strange sounds behind her. The beings weren't far away, but now the only thought on her mind was to survive, any way possible. Despite her desperate efforts to escape, Penelope soon realized something was wrong. She felt a growing pressure around her body, as if an invisible force was squeezing her skin, preventing her from moving freely. Each step became more difficult, slower, as if the air around him was solidifying, turning into a physical obstacle. She was being restrained, although there were no ropes visible. It was an invisible trap, and no matter how hard she tried to fight it, her body was being controlled by a force beyond human comprehension. Penelope screamed, panicked, trying to fight the force that enveloped her. His scream echoed through the woods, but it was in vain. Within seconds, she was lifted off the ground, her feet no longer touching the earth, as if invisible hands were dragging her into the unknown. The feeling of helplessness was devastating. Her arms and legs were immobilized, and she could barely breathe, as if the air was being sucked from her lungs. As she floated, her vision began to darken, and she struggled not to pass out. Then, in the midst of her blurred vision, she saw it. The ship. It wasn't like she had imagined as a child, with the typical flying saucers in science fiction stories. No, this ship was much more terrifying. A colossus of black metal and impossible geometric shapes, shining with a light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She seemed to be materializing out of thin air, emerging from the shadows of the forest like a predator finally revealing itself. The lights coming from it were cold, almost numbing, and its shape was something beyond human comprehension. An alien architecture that defied logic and gravity. Penelope felt her mind begin to give in to absolute fear. She knew something terrible was about to happen. Everything around him was distorted, and his mind was on the verge of collapse. However, before he could scream again, a wave of drowsiness began to invade his mind. It was as if an invisible fog was forcing his eyes closed. Penelope tried to fight the sensation, but it was useless. Her vision went completely dark, and before succumbing to forced sleep, the last thing she saw was the cold, inhuman gaze of one of the beings, watching her with black, empty eyes, as if he was about to accomplish something indescribable. When Penelope woke up, she was no longer in the woods. What awaited her was far worse than any nightmare she had ever imagined. She was inside the ship, and the horror was just beginning. The awakening was slow and painful, as if Penelope was emerging from a heavy, dense nightmare, but unfortunately, the nightmare was just beginning. The first thing he noticed was the light. It wasn't natural light, it was something unnatural and disturbing, cold and dull, emanating from the smooth ceiling of the room in which she found herself. The light didn't flicker. It didn't flicker. It just existed, enveloped in an unsettling stillness. Penelope tried to move, but found that her body was completely immobilized. She was lying on what appeared to be a metal table, hard and cold, with invisible but incredibly strong straps binding her arms, legs, and even her head. She looked around, her eyes still adjusting to the scene. The walls of the room had a curved shape with no visible corners, made of a material she couldn't identify. It was as if everything was fused into one solid piece, with no flaws or seams. The air smelled chemical, sterile, something that disgusted her. Every detail of that environment seemed designed to be completely inhumane, as if every trace of comfort had been intentionally removed. Then she saw them again, the beings. Once again, their presence took her completely, freezing any logical thought. Their bodies were thin and elongated, with pale, almost translucent skin, as if they could barely contain the bone structure that supported their shapes. But it was the eyes that terrified her most. Big, black, and lifeless, eyes that watched with a disturbing calm as if human pain were a scientific curiosity and nothing more. Two of them stood out. One, in a sort of fitted white suit, seemed to command the others. His posture was one of authority and absolute control. The other was even more terrifying, with a grotesque mask covering his face, from which tubes came out that moved like snakes. Penelope tried to scream, but her throat was dry, and her words died before they could make a sound. A device was brought to her, something that looked like a helmet filled with glowing needles. As the being with the grotesque mask held him, Penelope knew that her life would never be the same. The needles penetrated his skull with surgical precision, and the impact was immediate. A sharp pain shot through his head, as if his brain was being ripped apart from the inside. The helmet began to emit vibrations, and Penelope felt her body twitch involuntarily. The muscular contractions were violent, and she found herself fighting indescribable agony. The worst thing, however, was the feeling that something was invading his mind. He felt his thoughts being ripped from his control, as if his memories were pages of a book torn and flipped brutally. As the device did its work, Penelope saw flashes of her memories being projected before her eyes. Memories of his childhood in Paris, the moments with his mother, the last days before her death. Everything was being invaded, explored, and exposed to those soulless creatures. His mind, his innermost sanctuary, was being violated. Then, just when Penelope thought there was nothing left to extract, the memories turned into visions. Images of an alternate reality began to flood his mind, projected directly by the aliens. She saw scenes of a destroyed Earth, ravaged by wars, pandemics, and seemingly endless chaos. Cities that once sparkled with human progress were now in ruins. But it wasn't just the images of destruction that terrified her. There was something much more disturbing. The scene changed, and before her eyes Penelope saw the image of a utopian future, but not a human future. Earth was dominated by a new race, a horrible mixture of humans and aliens. The cities were completely revamped, a perfect balance of advanced technology and restored nature. But something essential was missing: human freedom. The population now lived under the constant supervision of hybrids, creatures that seemed to be the link between humans and the aliens that now dominated the planet. Then, Penelope saw something that froze her blood. A boy appeared in his visions. He wasn't like the other human children she knew. His eyes were larger, his skin had a slightly pale tone, and there was a coldness in his gaze that was completely unnatural. Penelope knew, in some inexplicable way, that that boy was the result of a union between human and alien. He wasn't just any hybrid creature, he had a purpose. "This will be your son," a cold voice echoed in his mind. Penelope tried to resist, tried to free herself from that horrible vision, but the truth was being brutally forced upon her. "He will be the leader of a new era. He will bring peace, but under the absolute control of our species." The voice's words resonated inside her, devoid of emotion, but carrying a terrible weight. Penelope wanted to scream, but she couldn't. The terror of being chosen to generate such a monstrous being, destined to subjugate all of humanity, was overwhelming. She understood then that she was not just another victim. She was a pawn in a much larger plan, destined to alter the course of Earth's history. The creatures weren't just studying humans, they were shaping humanity's future. And Penelope was a vital part of that dark future. The visions didn't stop. Now, she saw clearly the aliens' plan. A virus would be released on Earth, wiping out most of the population. Only those genetically compatible would survive. These survivors, along with the hybrids, would rebuild society, but under alien control. Penelope felt a wave of despair take over her body. There was no escaping this reality, this destiny that had been imposed on him. She wasn't just a prisoner, it was a tool, an instrument of what could be the end of humanity as it knew it. And the terrible truth was just beginning to be revealed. Penelope was plunged into a spiral of psychological horror. The visions the aliens forced her to see, the hybrid boy who would be her son, and the dark fate that awaited Earth were seared into her mind like invisible scars. As her body remained immobilized on the metal table, her mind was slowly being manipulated in ways she never imagined possible. The aliens weren't just invading his memories, they were reshaping his thoughts, his perception of reality, and, even worse, his own emotions. She felt the presence of the creatures in her mind, as if their cold hands ran through every corner of her deepest thoughts, pulling out secrets she didn't even know she possessed. The feeling was of a constant and relentless invasion, a torture that left no physical wounds but that devastated his spirit. Penelope tried to resist, to try to keep some trace of herself intact, but the strength of the aliens was overwhelming. From time to time, they implanted visions in his mind. Some were scenes of pure devastation, wars, mass deaths, global pandemics. Others, however, were visions of a bright future where peace reigned on Earth, but at the cost of all humanity being controlled by them. In these visions, hybrid beings, children of experiments like the ones Penelope was about to face, ruled the planet coldly and efficiently, with no room for human feelings such as compassion, love, or freedom. Humanity had become a cog in an alien machine of domination. Penelope saw herself in that future, But she was no longer the woman she knew. She was just a shadow, a prisoner of her own body, no voice, no will of her own, just an empty vessel for the future the aliens had planned. The terror she felt was so intense that reality and illusion began to blend together. She no longer knew what was real. Her senses betrayed her. Her own body seemed to no longer belong to her. The aliens had achieved what they wanted. They had broken his mind. There was no escape. There was no hope. She was completely at their mercy, trapped in an endless cycle of psychological terror, where every thought was distorted, every memory corrupted. She was no longer just Penelope Bernadette Gambier. Now she was just a piece of a cosmic experiment, a plaything in the hands of beings who saw her as nothing more than an object. Penelope didn't know how long it had been since she was captured. His days were a blur of painful procedures, invasive experiments, and incessant mental torture. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. She began to feel something strange inside her, a feeling of pressure in her abdomen, which could not be ignored. At first, he tried to believe that it was just another reaction to the experiments that had been done on his body. But as time passed, the truth became inevitable. She was pregnant. Penelope panicked. How could this be possible? She had not had contact with any human being since her capture. Then the terrible reality set in his mind. The aliens had used his body to create something hybrid, something that shouldn't exist. Feeling a new life growing inside him that wasn't entirely human was the worst kind of nightmare. Every movement, every slight sensation of something moving in her belly, was a reminder that she was at the mercy of a much greater force. A force that saw her as just an incubator for its experiments. The days that followed were filled with indescribable terror. As the pregnancy progressed, Penelope felt her body changing in ways she never imagined possible. The pregnancy did not follow the normal rhythm of a human pregnancy. It was fast, relentless, as if the creature inside her was sucking her own vitality to grow faster. She saw the shape of her body distort, and the idea that an alien being was taking shape inside her filled her with absolute horror. The aliens monitored every moment, watching with cold, distant interest. There was no compassion, no attempts to ease her physical or emotional pain. To them, Penelope was just an experiment, and her suffering was irrelevant. With each new day, she felt the burden of that monstrous pregnancy grow, both physically and emotionally. The creature within her was not just a being she was destined to carry, it was a symbol of humanity's destiny, a portent of what was to come. She began to wonder if she would ever be able to escape this fate. Would that being growing inside her end up being her own executioner? The idea of giving birth to a hybrid creature, of being forced to bring it into the world and witnessing the beginning of the new alien age, was almost unbearable. But just as her escape had failed, Penelope knew she had no choice. She was trapped in that cycle of horror, and the moment to face the end result of her capture was fast approaching. As the physical and emotional terror of the accelerated pregnancy gnawed at Penelope, something unexpected began to emerge within her. A small, fragile thread of hope. With each movement of the creature in her womb, the need for survival rekindled something primordial within her. The desire to flee, to fight against the destiny that had been imposed on her. She had already accepted the idea that she was being used as an incubator, but her mind, despite the aliens' attempts to destroy it, still struggled to remain intact. Running away no longer seemed like just a wish. It was a question of survival, of preventing something even worse from happening. She knew that the aliens were watching her constantly, monitoring every change in her body and every attempt at resistance. However, Penelope began to pay attention to the routines, the patterns of the beings that held her captive. There were moments, brief, but real, when the vigilance over her seemed to wane. These moments were like small cracks in a seemingly impenetrable wall, and it was in these moments that Penelope began to hatch a plan. She didn't know how, or even if it was possible, but the idea of escaping from that monstrous ship began to take shape in her mind. The key to their escape would be to wait for one of those brief moments of carelessness when the aliens seemed to be gone for a few hours. There was also the matter of his own weakness. Her body was worn out, not only from the weight of pregnancy, but also from the experiments she had endured. But Penelope decided that her mental strength would have to be enough. She had to try, even if the chance of success was slim. The moment came on a silent night. She noticed that there wasn't the usual movement of aliens around her. The room was enveloped in that cold, unnatural light. and Penelope, using all her strength, began to try to loosen the invisible bonds that held her to the bed. His body ached, his muscles were weakened, but the adrenaline was pushing his mind and his heart. I felt that if it weren't for that moment, I would never have another opportunity. For a brief moment he managed to free himself. His heart raced and a wave of hope coursed through his body. Trying to ignore the pain and weakness, she got up from the bed, her shaky legs barely holding her up. Every step she took felt like a fight against gravity. But she was moving, determined to find a way out. But as he struggled to escape, something terrible began to happen. An overwhelming pain took over his body. It was as if her belly was on fire. Penelope fell to her knees, panting, and the reality of her situation hit her full force. The birth had begun. There was no escaping that creature inside her. She felt the violent contractions, each one worse than the last, as if her body was being ripped from the inside out. She knew, deep in her soul, that she wouldn't be able to escape that place before the creature was born. The aliens, apparently aware of what was happening, reappeared almost instantly. There was no hurry in his movements. They approached Penelope with the same calculated calm as always. His escape had been futile. She was back in their control. And now, what came was the moment they had been waiting for, the birth of the hybrid creature. Penelope was placed back on the metal bed, her cries of pain echoing through the cold, sterile room. The contractions were relentless, one after another, giving her no time to breathe. The terror of feeling the creature moving violently inside her was more than any human being should bear. She knew that what was about to come out of her body was not natural. It was not human. The aliens began to prepare their equipment, not bothering about Penelope's suffering. To them, she was nothing more than a means to an end. His cold, black eyes watched her with a disturbing intensity as her body fought the pains of labor. She screamed, cried, but none of it seemed to matter. Every scream that came out of his throat was ignored, as if it were just another background sound in the experiment they were carrying out. Finally, after an eternity of unbearable pain, Penelope felt the creature's body leave her. The physical relief was immediate, but the psychological horror was just beginning. What she saw was a vision that would be etched in her mind forever. The creature was no ordinary baby. His skin was pale, almost gray, with disproportionately large black eyes. He was small, fragile, but there was something in those eyes that made her shudder. They were smart, much more than they should have been. And at that moment, Penelope knew that her worst nightmare had come true. The creature, his son, emitted a high-pitched and disturbing scream, which resonated through the walls of the ship. The aliens picked him up, analyzing him with clinical interest, as if he were a precious object of their research. Penelope, completely exhausted and traumatized, could barely process what had just happened. She had given birth to a hybrid creature, and now she didn't know what would come next. The birth of the creature had left Penelope completely exhausted, both physically and mentally. She was lying motionless as she watched the aliens take her son away. The high-pitched sound that the creature made after being born still echoed in her mind, a scream that seemed to reverberate in the depths of her soul, leaving her emotionally torn apart. The silence that followed was almost worse than the pain of childbirth itself, as it was filled with an immense emptiness, a feeling of total defeat. Penelope felt stripped of any strength, stripped of any identity. She was no longer herself, it was just a vessel, a body used for a purpose she never asked for or wanted. In the hours following her birth, the aliens continued to monitor her, insensitive to her suffering. They left her lying on that metal table, tied by invisible forces, without any care or compassion. Penelope felt weakness taking over her body, and her mind, although exhausted, couldn't turn off. The birth scene played over and over in his head, every detail recorded with painful precision. The sight of that creature, its pale skin, its disproportionate black eyes, the inhuman sound it made, was not something she could simply forget. It was a brand that would last forever. And then the changes began. Penelope began to notice that her body was different. It wasn't just the weakness of childbirth, it was something deeper. There was pain, yes, but it was a pain that seemed to be engraved in his bones, in his insides. She felt drained, as if something essential had been ripped out of her. Her skin, once pale, now seemed almost translucent, and she noticed that her senses were sharper, but not in the way she wanted. There was an agonizing sensitivity in his body, as if every touch, every sound, every light was amplified intolerably. Mentally, things were even worse. Penelope had nightmares, always repeating the same scene. The birth of more hybrid creatures all looking at her with those inhuman eyes, judging her, watching her like an object. His mind was fragmented, torn between the horrible reality he was living in and the terrors that the aliens had implanted in his psyche. She began to lose track of time, each second dragging on like an eternity. What was once a strong, determined woman was now a broken reflection, a shadow of who she once was. Penelope knew she needed to react, but how? She was completely at their mercy, a prisoner of her own body and the mental prison the aliens had built around her. As Penelope battled her own inner demons, a disturbing new revelation took hold of her mind. During one of her rare moments of lucidity, as the aliens went about their daily procedures, she heard something different. Coming from far away, from the bottom of that monstrous ship, Penelope began to distinguish sounds. It was something she couldn't put her finger on at first, but as she focused her attention, the truth came to light. She wasn't alone. There were other women. At first, she thought perhaps it was just a reflection of her weakened mental state. But as the days passed, the sounds became clearer. Moans of pain, muffled cries, anguished screams. These sounds echoed through the ship's metallic corridors, confirming an even more terrible truth. She was not the only victim. Other women were there too, trapped in the same cycle of horror and experimentation that Penelope had experienced. This discovery caused a new wave of terror to wash over her. How many other women had been captured? How many of them had gone through the same nightmare as her, being forced to generate hybrid creatures? Penelope began to realize that she was just another piece in a much larger, more sinister puzzle. The aliens weren't just interested in her. They were creating a new race en masse. And these other women were the incubators for that terrible future. She began to pay more attention, trying to find out more about her fellow captives. The aliens didn't seem to care whether or not Penelope heard the other women's distant sounds. To them, she was just a part of the experiment, and her feelings or thoughts didn't matter. But for Penelope, that was a turning point. Knowing that others were suffering the same fate as her brought a sense of desperation, but also of urgency. Maybe if there were more women there might be a chance, however small, for them to unite, to fight against that hell in which they were trapped. She began to fantasize about meeting these other women, about forming a resistance, about escaping that ship together. But at the same time, I knew the aliens were powerful, ruthless. The reality of escaping such a cosmic prison seemed like a distant fantasy. But even that fantasy, however unlikely it was the only thing Penelope had left in that moment of absolute despair. The cycle of pain and terror continued, but now, with the new awareness that other women were involved, the burden felt somehow heavier. And yet, maybe, just maybe, it was also a spark of hope, however small. Penelope's days on the alien ship continued to drag on, each one bringing with it a new form of physical and psychological torment. However, the discovery that there were other captive women like her planted a seed of hope, however fragile. Hearing their wails and screams, Penelope knew that they were also going through the same horrors as her. The idea that she was not alone brought a new resolution. If they could be there, maybe together they could do something to change that reality. Even if the chance of success was slim, the idea of passively submitting to that fate was worse than death. With each passing day, she began to pay more attention to the aliens and their routines. Despite their powers and advanced technology, the beings were not perfect. Penelope noticed that they had moments of absence, as if they needed to focus on other parts of the ship or on other experiments. These moments, although short, could be the only opportunity for an escape attempt. And she couldn't do it alone. In one of these moments of silence and relative calm, Penelope tried to get the attention of another prisoner. She heard her distant moans, and in a barely audible whisper, began to call her. At first, the woman didn't respond, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of weakness, but little by little, Penelope heard a return. A soft sound that indicated someone was listening. The connection has been established. Penelope began to organize in her mind what a rebellion would be. I didn't know how many prisoners were on the ship, but I knew that together they could perhaps cause a distraction, or even attack the aliens during one of their lapses in attention. They began communicating in short bursts, exchanging basic information about the aliens' schedules and movements. Communication was risky. Any sign that they were trying to organize themselves and the creatures could intensify the proceedings. But the despair was greater than the fear. Penelope knew that her strength was running out, both physical and emotional, and that this would be her only chance. The day of revolt has finally arrived. During one of the lapses in surveillance, Penelope and other prisoners, weakened over time but still filled with an unshakable will to survive, began to move. They attacked with anything they could find: loose pieces of metal, tools left behind, their own nails and teeth if necessary. The goal was not to defeat the aliens, but to create a distraction large enough for them to escape. Chaos took over the room. The prisoners screamed, attacking with fury and desperation. The creatures, taken by surprise, initially did not react in a coordinated manner, which gave the women a slight advantage. For a few seconds it seemed that, against all odds, they might escape. The chaos generated by the revolt was greater than Penelope could have imagined. The prisoners fought with all their might, using anything they found around them, driven by a primal fury that had long been suppressed. The screams echoed off the metal walls of the ship, mixing with the sound of metal against metal, as the aliens tried, in vain, to regain control. Penelope led the group, driven by an adrenaline rush that she barely knew she still had in her weakened body. His thoughts revolved around a single objective: freedom or death. But as the revolt progressed, hope was slowly replaced by a cruel reality. The aliens' resistance increased as they regained control of the situation. They were fast, faster than any human, and soon the prisoners began to fall. Penelope saw one after another being pinned down, thrown to the ground with cold, calculated brutality. The forces that had been awakened by the prisoners began to crumble under the weight of the alien response. Penelope, however, continued to fight. She was bruised, bleeding, but her eyes remained fixed on a distant point in the room. The exit, a door that throughout her capture had seemed inaccessible. Now, even with her chances reduced, she was moving towards that point with all her strength. One of the prisoners, a woman who had remained silent until that moment, joined her, and together they ran towards that portal of freedom. However, as soon as Penelope got close to the exit, she felt a searing pain run down her spine. A cold light enveloped her, the same light that had consumed Gilbert so long ago. His body remained still. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. It was as if the same invisible force that had initially captured her had returned to remind her that there was no escape. That no matter how hard she tried, no matter how hard she fought, she was trapped in this macabre fate. The aliens approached slowly, cold and calculating, watching with their black, inhuman eyes. Penelope could feel the life draining from her body. His vision began to blur, and the sound of everything around him became distant. His last vision was of the woman beside him, falling to the ground, and silence once again dominated the environment. There was no victory. There was no escape. With her last strand of consciousness, Penelope realized the harsh truth. That ship was not just a physical prison, but a mental, emotional, and spiritual prison. And now, even amidst the chaos, the next phase of his nightmare was about to begin. She had fought, she had tried, but the aliens had always been one step ahead, controlling her every move, every thought, every emotion. She wasn't just stuck in that place. She was part of something bigger, something far beyond her understanding, something that consumed her completely. And in the end, there was no more fight to be fought. Penelope's story is a dark reminder of how the unknown can not only challenge us physically, but also mentally and emotionally. She was pushed to the limits of her human endurance, forced to confront horrors that transcended understanding. Although her fight was courageous, what happened to her leads us to reflect. How far are we willing to go to preserve our humanity? And in the end, do we have any real control over destiny, or are we just following a path already set by forces beyond us? What do you think? To what extent does the fear of the unknown control us? Leave your opinion in the comments. We want to hear what you think about this terrifying story. If you like this narrative and want to follow more stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any news. We have many more exciting and suspenseful stories on the way. Stick around and get ready for the next reports.